Who is my neighbor? It's an important question, and it doesn't sound complicated. But Jesus answered this very simple question with a twist. Our story today begins in an uncomplicated manner. Jesus was approached by a lawyer. Not a lawyer as we know lawyers, but rather an expert in the Jewish law. Now, in those days, what these people liked to do was spend hours debating the finer points of the law. And I think that's still a popular pastime amongst rabbinic circles. And so one of these experts decided to test Jesus. This was not necessarily a hostile act. This is just what these men did. It was what they liked to do. He asked, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus responded in traditional academic form, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" The man answered with words that Jesus himself used in both Matthew and Mark's Gospels. He said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." On this occasion, Jesus replied to the man, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But then it gets interesting, because the man asked another question. We're told he wanted to justify himself, and so he said, "And who is my neighbor?" At face value, he was asking, "Who must I love?" In reality, he was asking, "Who is it I don't have to love? Who can I kind of safely ignore? Who's an option for me?" Now, this lawyer would have known that the Old Testament law, while often giving preferential status to Jews, made it clear that the alien living among the people was to be treated as a citizen. Foreigners were not to be treated badly simply because they were not Jews. There was no legal and illegal status at the time. It's just, you were born here, you were born somewhere else. You're Jewish, you're not. Guess what? You're all human. You should all be accorded the same love, respect, thoughtfulness, kindness. The foreigner residing amongst you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. The people were always to be mindful of the plight of the foreigner living among them, because they were once foreigners in Egypt. Now, Jesus could have simply said, "You know the answer to this. It's everyone." That would have been the inclusive biblical answer. But some rabbis at the time did not teach this. They taught that only Jews were to be accorded this treatment and this favored status. And then there were rabbis who were Pharisees among them who said, "It's not just Jews who's my neighbor." What is going on with that? If I stand too close to, I can't move out here. I will make weird noises. Not making weird noises. This is good. Only Jews who keep the law in a very precise, very legalistic way, everything exact, up to our standard. Only a Pharisee. They're the only ones we have to treat well. They're our neighbors. Those slackers down the street that don't do it right, no. So people had different hierarchies of who counted, who didn't count, who we have to treat nice, who we can treat terribly, who we have to be honest with, who we can cheat. there were all of these rankings that human beings came up with. So, given all these undercurrents, Jesus did not give a simple answer. Instead, he gave a complicated answer. Jesus told a story, the story of the Good Samaritan. When I was a little girl, I was never told that Samaritans were despised by the Jews. That's not my faith, but it could have been. Nobody told me that Samaritan was not anything other than wonderful. Being a good Samaritan was a good thing. I had no idea that the Samaritan came from a religious ethnic group that the Jews as a whole regarded as heretical and inferior. As we have discussed in the past few weeks, Samaritans were of mixed blood. They were the product of the remnant of the Jews left behind in the exile and the foreigners that the conquerors brought in. Those two groups intermarried and produced the Samaritans. Even though the Samaritans still practiced what was essentially an earlier form of Judaism, the Jews rejected them. They were no longer pure. The Samaritan hero of this story, then, is one that the expert in the law would most certainly reject. He would be appalled to be given this man as a role model. And if he were in the position of the victim of the crime, it would be unbelievably galling for him to receive help from a Samaritan. Trying to come up with an image that captures the truly visceral reaction this man would have had in his gut is challenging. It would be like the leader of an anti-gay organization being rescued by the organizer of the local gay pride march. It would be like the chairman of the NAACP rescuing the head of the KKK. It would be like Trump's anti-immigrant advisor, Stephen Miller, being saved from certain death by an illegal Guatemalan immigrant. That's what it would feel like. The Samaritan is the third person in a classic three-part drama. The storytelling style of the day calls for a third character in a series of three. The first two do something expected, the third does something different. Given that the first two characters were officials, a priest and a Levite, probably what the lawyer and the others in the crowd were expecting is a noble, ordinary Jew showing up the, establishment. But Jesus didn't do that. Instead, he chose someone generally held in contempt to play the part of the hero. The story begins. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. This is reporting in from the Department of Duh. Of course he was. Doesn't anybody in their right mind at the time know that you did not travel that road unless you were in a convoy? That's a very dangerous road. Everyone knew that. Jerusalem was on a mountain 2,000 feet above sea level, 17 miles later further down, and 846 feet below sea level is Jericho, right next to the all-inclusive, lovely Dead Sea. I'm not sure there are holidays there. The road is a windy, rocky nightmare, even today. And there are plenty of places to be ambushed and for attackers to escape. So we know at the get-go, either this man was abandoned by his friends, or he made a very foolish decision and traveled alone. But in case you haven't noticed, people do stupid things all the time. It's one of our great struggles in life. I've done stupid things, other people do stupid things. It makes me crazy. But we're human, and we do. And although we might say we're not going to help somebody because they did it to themselves, and we differentiate between the deserving and the undeserving, those who have common sense and those who don't, God helps us all, which is a very good thing. The robbers did more than rob this man. They stripped him of his clothes. They beat him, left him half dead, and went away. This man was completely vulnerable and totally humiliated. To be naked in this culture was the gravest shame. And here he lay, naked, bleeding, and either conscious or semi-conscious. His very condition may have been a determining factor in whether or not people wanted to help him. I mean, after all, how could any respectable person bear to look upon that man lying there naked? Just turn away, walk from him. It is very noticeable that even in all of our modern or not so modern art, all of our artistic portrayals, for the most part, I found one that didn't, but for the most part, have covered him, at least in the important places, with something. They grabbed a cloth from somewhere and draped it over the man. There's no cloth. There's no nothing. This man is exposed. And very significantly, because this man was naked, there was no way to identify him. It was impossible to tell what class he was from, what his level of education was, if he was a Pharisee, a scribe, if he was an ordinary workman. He could have even been a dreaded Samaritan. There was no way to know if by the world standards he was important or not. If he had been dressed as a Levite or a priest, maybe the Levite or priest would have helped him because, he was one of their own. But he was simply human and in urgent need of help. We know the story. The priest passed by and did not stop and help. The Levite did the same. Priests and Levites were both descended from Aaron, and priests had extra responsibilities and could become ritually unclean very easily and be unable to conduct their work. If the man was dead and either one of them had touched him, they would have both been unclean for 7 days and have to go through 2 ritual purifications. Maybe they were afraid they might be attacked. After all, those robbers could be close by. Maybe the thought of transporting an injured man was just too much of an inconvenience. I mean, helping someone out can take up your whole day. And of course, anyone helping the man would have had to give up his own mount in order to do it. Who wants to give up their ride? But all of these reasons and excuses just boil down to one thing: blatant self-interest and selfishness. When the Samaritan arrived, he was moved with pity. He immediately went to the man. He bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. He put the man on his own donkey. He brought him to an inn, and he took care of him. And he did this for a complete stranger. A Samaritan traveling through Jewish territory could not expect any help from a Jew. And yet here it is, the Samaritan being the rescuer. But when Jesus then asked, "Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" the expert in the law couldn't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. Instead, he said, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. This is an incredible story. It challenges us to the core. It causes us to consider who our neighbor is from many different angles. Our neighbor can be somebody we don't want. Our neighbor can be somebody we despise or fear. The Samaritan was willing to be a neighbor to the wounded man, and the wounded man accepted his help. But if this man had not been wounded, he might have even spit upon the Samaritan. And there is also an incredible irony here, because it could have been concern for religious purity that prevented the priest and the Levite from acting as a neighbor. In an effort to follow the legalistic requirements of the law, they may have missed the point completely. But because this is a story, not an actual historical event, we only have questions, no answers. And that's really the point, to give us the questions. It was the unclean Samaritan who fulfilled the requirement of the law to love your neighbor as yourself. And in this story, no one else did. Clearly, neighbors are not just people who live physically next door. I don't know about you, but I've got some really interesting neighbors. I've got a junk man who lives across the street. Trust me, it's really interesting in my neighborhood. But all my neighbors, as different as they are, they're included in this. But so are other people that I might meet just in the course of my day, or people I might hear about who are nowhere near where I live. Our neighbor is whoever God has placed in our path of awareness. No matter how different they are from us, we are called to show love. God asks us to open our eyes and see them. I am the worst for tunnel vision. You can ask Vicki about this, especially if I'm driving. I don't see anything. It's like, hello, yeah, Blessing's been there, hello, and I'm like in a zone. The world does not exist. I'm thinking about the driving. Usually I'm thinking about something else. But God says, hello, Lisa, open your eyes. Look at people, observe, be aware, be sensitive to their needs. There have been times I've walked past somebody in the street and they've looked distressed. I don't know that person, but I pray for them. I may never meet them, I may never find out what's going in their lives, but I pray for them. And it's occurred to me, how many times have I walked down the street in my life and been distressed, and someone has seen me and prayed for me? And that I will find out someday in heaven how we have helped one another and been completely unaware of the help given. God wants us to see people and not ignore the need. Like the Samaritan, we are to be compassionate and to genuinely care and be willing to be inconvenienced. And this is hard for us, isn't it? I mean, hey, we've got a schedule. We've got things to do. We've got places to go. We've got appointments. We've got, the kids have this, and this.